While I was preparing to put together this review, I've come to a realization. Well, more of an admission, really. I play way too many games about vampires. I think that between my love of vampires and vampire myths, and my obsession with the Lovecraft mythos, I could rebrand as a specialty channel and not run out of content anytime soon. And come to think of it, this is now the second year in a row that I'm playing a game featuring vampires for my Halloween special. But the difference between last year's game, Vlad the Impaler, and this year's game, Dark, released by Realmforge in 2013, is that I enjoyed playing the former. Yes, it was a simple game and it was limited in its scope, but I was pleasantly surprised with how evocative it was. It was aware of its limitations and skirted around them in order to play up to its strengths. Expressive writing that elicited a strong sense of dread. Now, Dark, on the other hand, is a meandering mess of an action stealth game that tries way too hard to play like games far above its station, and failing gloriously at it. It really wants to be a pulpy noir title that combines hardcore stealth gameplay with the supernatural power fantasy of playing a vampire, so basically what it feels like to play Vampire the Masquerade Revised Edition. The thing is that Dark suffers from a slew of missteps and shortcomings that make it an absolute chore to play. Even more than something like Daikatana, because at least with Daikatana, it had some good ideas and elements wrapped up beneath its staggeringly slow narrative pace and shoddy AI. Dark has no such fallback. It has barely any redeeming qualities, if at all. It's just a straight up bad game with brief flashes of mediocrity peppered in throughout. So get ready for some not quite so heart-pumping action and excitement. This is Dark. So right off the bat, perhaps the least offensive of Dark's issues are its visuals. Now keeping in mind this is a 2013 indie title, I'm not expecting Dark to look like it's on par with its AAA counterparts. That's just unrealistic. And you know what? Dark doesn't actually look half bad. Most textures are made up of fairly high resolution models, and maps are pretty well detailed. Furthermore, the game has some fairly decent lighting and shadowing, although you would think that such systems would have an effect on gameplay, but they really don't. More on that later. Most notably, however, is Dark's decision to use a heavy stroke effect in order to highlight pretty much every single character and object model in the game, giving everything a thick black border. In doing so, the game tries to emphasize its pulpy nature by being evocative of a comic book, which is reiterated by the game's use of a first-person narration at the beginning and the end of every level. While I admire the effort that the devs put into at least attempt to create an effect that would make Dark stand out, in the end the final package is just one that's duff and pretty forgettable. Honestly, all it does is remind me of Guides of the Wolf, and that's not a good thing.
Helps to have a map.
What's worse are the game's animations, which are incredibly stiff and lifeless. Lip syncing barely works, and most conversations you have will look like you're watching an old English dub of a Shaw Brothers movie.
That is correct. Right now you also have a much bigger problem you need to take care of.
Hey, you're Eric, right? I don't have much time. As you can see, I'm kinda busy.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm doing fine. Did I come to the club alone, or was someone with me?
Walking and running animations look very odd, with the protagonist looking like he's gliding on a sheet of ice instead of walking on solid ground. And the sound effects don't quite match up to his footsteps every time he puts his weight down on the floor. Enemy animations are just as bad too. Guards you kill during missions react in these motions that are simultaneously exaggerated and undersold, like the NPCs know they're prone to overacting and a movie director shooting the whole thing told them to tone it down. When you grab them from behind, all the guard does is wiggle his arms a little bit before you snap his neck or feed on him or pull off one of these over-the-top killing animations before he slumps to the ground. It comes together in such a bad way that the whole thing has this unshakable feeling of obsolescence to pretty much every aspect of it. It's so palpable that you can feel the game's age when you play it. And that same level of schlockiness spills over to the game's main narrative, to nobody's surprise. Dark's story is as bland and cliched as you may expect. The game starts off with our protagonist, Eric Bain.
My name is Eric. Eric Bain.
Feeling really woozy as he stumbles around a nightclub. He's eventually found by the club staff and they explain to him that he's actually just been turned into a vampire. Boy, it sure was lucky that he happened to be in a nightclub that was staffed and owned by vampires as this revelation was made. And wouldn't you know it, he is suffering from some short-term amnesia too. Anyway, Eric soon learns that he's actually only a half-vampire. And if he doesn't drink the blood of the vampire who turned him, he'll turn into a ghoul, a mindless vampire who's basically an animal at this point. However, the club's owner, Rose, offers our boy another solution. If Geralt of Rivia over here can drink the blood of another, more powerful vampire than him, he'll be able to still become a full-fledged Night Stalker, and thus, the game begins. So, following this premise, you'll travel from level to level, stalking in corporate offices, nightclubs, and museums as you hunt down these big bad evil ancient vampires and their mortal minions in your quest to prevent your own ghoulish deterioration. As you play through the game, there's an angel that visits you every so often, usually at the end of a level, to tease you that your proverbial princess is in another castle, meaning that the blood you just drank wasn't enough to turn you into a full-fledged vampire. There's also a secret government organization that's conducting tests on vampires or some such, and somehow Eric's mixed up in this grand conspiracy, and... Alright, I'm gonna level with you here. I didn't finish playing Dark. I put 7 hours into it going through the first 3 or so chapters, and that was enough for me to sit down and write this review, honestly. There was so little iteration in those 7 hours that I played that honestly, I cannot see the game changing very much at all had I continued it towards the end. Now, I'm bringing this up to contextualize this, and to emphasize the fact that I'm speculating here. But I believe Dark is trying to set up a twist ending that you can see a mile off. My guess is that the angel that you see during the game's early levels is in fact the head scientist for the government organization that is doing these experiments on vampires, and the reason that Eric's diablerie-ridden evenings don't amount to anything is because that he was created in a lab and is a secret tool used to hunt down and kill the rest of the vampires in the city. Now, if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me in the comments below and tell me, or if you know the ending, please do share. But my point is that while I may not know what the twist is, I damn sure know that the game is setting me up for one, and I'm bringing this up to really emphasize how flat and uninspired the game's writing is. It stinks of cliché, and there's nothing redeeming about this because all of this is dreadfully uninteresting. Cliché story aside, the game does try to make an effort to at least characterize the boss fights as being these very evil, very bad characters that the world isn't gonna miss, thus really pounding into your head that you're the good guy.
Blooming is one crazy son of a bitch. Guy really ain't got both oars in the water, man. I met him about a year ago because I was thinking about working for him, but that dude is crazy. You know, it's gotten even worse over the last few months. The last one who went over to see him never returned. He figured Blooming killed him.
Sounds like fun.
Sure, man, if you got a thing for nutcases.
The problem here is that this is the epitome of lazy writing. Simply telling the audience that the person you're going after is a bad dude and then showing them hacking up a body before removing them from the game forever doesn't elicit any sort of emotional response. And because the game takes itself so damn seriously, it stands out as being so incredibly forced. There's no emotional resonance between anything or anyone. Everything's told to you in a dialogue option, and the few things that you see are just bland and cartoonish. Never mind as to how silly some of these world-building elements are. For instance, Rose, your mentor and handler during your missions, owns a nightclub where she watches over young vampires. Okay, fair enough. Common trope. Except for the fact that Rose states that she's only been a vampire for 10 years.
Well, it's been about 10 years since I was a normal human. I own this club, and I look after the young vampires, such as yourself.
Yeah, a decade of immortality constitutes a supernatural maturity in the world of Dark. Or like, why do the vampires you hunt down for their blood all have these mindless ghouls as pets? Especially since Rose tells you that vampires intentionally hide themselves away from mortals. Do you not think that this might give away part of that whole secret society thing that the game is trying to set up? These moments lead to this cognitive break between the game's narrative, which is something that it really wants to explore because it gives you dialogue options that reveal parts of the world to you, and it's more gamified elements which it includes for the sake of gameplay challenges. What I mean by that is things like ghouls make sense as enemies for a stealth game, increasing the amount of enemy variety that you're running into and giving you different challenges to overcome as you're playing the game, but the means by which they're incorporated makes absolutely no sense from a narrative perspective. It's very lazy. So, okay, maybe Dark just put some kind of a story into the game because that's what was expected out of it. Maybe Dark is more focused on its gameplay to carry it, and the story is an excuse to have a stealth game with awesome supernatural vampire powers. Well, there are several things wrong with that statement, most of which have to do with the fact that the gameplay is just about as terrible as everything else that I've talked about so far. As previously mentioned, Dark is a stealth game. However, it approaches its stealth sections much more aggressively than I've seen when compared to other games in the genre. What I mean by that is that, unlike other stealth games, Dark actually doesn't encourage you to avoid killing guards that stand in between you and the exit. Quite the opposite, actually. So Dark's system of progression revolves around experience points and unlocking talents, technically making this a AAA RPG. Most actions you do net you experience points. These points are then exchanged for different powers and ability upgrades. Thus, you're encouraged to accumulate as many points as possible in order to unlock your powers more quickly. The biggest payday in terms of XP is to go through a level being undetected. But since Dark breaks down its chapters into smaller levels that connect to each other, you're essentially playing through a small area to sneak to the other side, go through a transitional hallway, and then rinse and repeat until you can get to the boss level. What this means then is that every level in Dark is isolated from one another, and going from one to the next actually resets various stats, such as whether or not you've been detected or the amount of saves you have left. One thing that Dark doesn't reward you with, though, is giving you bonus experience for completing these levels as a pacifist. Instead, you're only awarded points for performing stealth kills on guards and hiding their bodies afterwards. That means that in Dark, sometimes the optimal thing to do is actually just murder a guard rather than to sneak by him, strictly speaking, so that you can unlock your powers faster. And if you can do this without being detected, so the better. Now, if you compare this approach to other stealth games, such as Hitman or Metal Gear Solid, or even Dark's own contemporaries like Dishonored or Mark of the Ninja, stealth games typically reward you for successfully managing to overcome their obstacles without shedding any blood. In fact, you're often incentivized to go that extra mile and challenge yourself because you receive much better rewards. And it seems to me Dark's design philosophies weren't entirely realized when the devs sat down to build the game. It doesn't exactly know what it wants you to do, I don't think. It wants you to kill guards because you're a vampire and stealth killing is a whole lot of fun, but it gives you powers that are hard to use without triggering many alarms, as some of the cooler powers will outright kill guards but it won't dispose of bodies, meaning that you're going to be detected very quickly. I can understand maybe wanting to create something with more leniency when it comes to the lethality of being a vampire, but from a gameplay perspective, all it does is reinforce that the best thing to do is kill everything on the floor, except for civilians because the game arbitrarily says you're not allowed to kill them, because at least that way, if you lose the XP bonus by getting detected, you're able to at least salvage some kind of ability progression out of the mess. But even then, Dark doesn't succeed in making you feel particularly powerful, and certainly not as an agent of your own actions. Despite the fact that the game makes it very obvious how it wants you to play it, it still doesn't give you enough basic functions in the way of stealth gameplay in order to make your efforts worthwhile. You would think that the lighting and shadows would have an effect on gameplay, but they don't. There are instances where I haven't been spotted standing in full light and instances where I've been spotted creeping around in the shadows. The game is very inconsistent in the way it makes you detectable. And what's more, levels offer virtually nothing in terms of interactivity. There are ledges that you can jump to and from and corners to hide around, and occasionally you'll come across an environmental trap like some broken glass or a motion detector speaker. Generally speaking, any of these environmental effects seem to be exceptions rather than rules, especially in the case of the latter two, which not only are they already few and far in between, but they seem to be exclusive to a particular level at the beginning of the game. And it's not just the lack of ways to interact with the environment that's a hindrance, but the levels themselves. Like I said before, the game breaks each level into different stages that follow a similar pattern. Your objective is to get to the end of the stage, go through a pair of doors to a corridor, and then move on to the next stage until you manage to get to a boss arena. Yes, a boss arena. This is a stealth game where you have boss fights, which isn't too weird in and of itself, but the way they're implemented just doesn't stand out from the way the rest of the game plays. You beat the level by sneaking up on the boss and killing them, naturally. They're no different than any other enemies in the game in terms of toughness or in terms of what you can actually do to them. The only real difference is that the arena you fight them in often has some kind of special limitations, like if you're fighting the sniper boss, you have to sneak behind him and perform a stealth kill. Or if you're fighting the butcher boss, you have to sneak behind him and perform a stealth kill. These areas themselves aren't particularly interesting, and they have very few tricks that make them stand out. They're built to funnel you in a particular direction, and that direction is always the door on the other side. There's very little sense of openness to these areas, and despite giving you the freedom to explore them at will, oftentimes there's only a single entranceway or exit that you're forced to use, giving you very little means of varying your strategy to get that point. It also uses a lot of choke points to really funnel you going into a particular way as well, and none of the levels are particularly wide either. There's very little to see, so even when you do go off the beaten path, there really isn't all that much except for maybe the occasional PDA that sheds a little more light into Dark's universe. The coherent, well thought out thing that it is. This is all further complicated by guards walking their patrols, obviously. However, their placement in some areas further forces you to go down particular paths that developers envisioned rather than truly giving you the tools to get to the exit by your own means. Even in some areas, like this museum lobby where you have several different paths to get to the other side, you're heavily incentivized to follow the path around the battlements and cross the room by descending to the second floor from the other side. It's so bad that the first level tutorial prompts don't actually even pop up if you deviate from the path that the devs have set out for you. You are flat out not given information if you're trying to do your own thing, even if you approach an objective from the opposite side. In the case of this guard right here, approaching him from the front would tell me how to perform a stealth kill. However, going up on the opposite side and coming at him from behind on the other side of this crate, I don't get the pop-up. Nor do I get it if I don't kill the previous guard before rounding the stairs up to get to this one. This is just sloppiness. It doesn't take into account player expression in these arenas, and it really makes for a linear railroady experience. Sometimes Dark will even resort to cheap video game ploys to force you to play in a certain way, like waiting for you to engage with a crucial objective before spawning enemies behind you without so much as a warning. All they're trying to do is force you to find an alternative path to your previous objective, but some kind of indication like a dialogue pop-up or a cutscene or something to let you know that there's been a change in the arena would be nice. And other times, the game just flat out refuses to let you progress unless you deal with an objective in a certain manner. Like in this case, where I'm actually not allowed to interact with the computer, despite actually coming up with a diversion in order to get the guard to leave. The game will only let you progress once it detects that the guard who's supposed to be standing in front of it is dead. That's the only way. The devs did not take into consideration any other solution, and that's inexcusable in this sort of game. Of course, levels are made even worse by the fact that you don't actually have any true hiding spots either. Think about that for a minute. It's a stealth game that doesn't have any hiding spots. Yes, you have walls that you could snap to for cover, but when things go badly and you get spotted, and that will happen, your only real recourse is to keep hugging around those walls and hope that nobody sees you from around the corner. You're encouraged to sort of wait it out, but the game also wants you to keep moving, otherwise you'll get spotted as guards swarm around the area that you were last seen. You can use one of your vampiric abilities called Shadow Jump to cover large distances quickly, and what this does is actually allow you to jump from one area of the map to another, basically like a teleportation thing. However, using it creates a sound, and guards are drawn towards that sound, which makes the process all the more difficult. Combine that with a cooldown, and you don't exactly get to use it as a get-out-of-jail-free card as you might expect. And that's not even saying how cumbersome it is to use the targeting reticle to time that jump or even aim where you want it to go. And all of this is made even more difficult because it's hard to know exactly what the patrols are seeing. You have no sense about what a particular guard's cone of vision or hearing radius is. It's all an abstract crapshoot that triggers only half the time. Now, there is a circle that turns deeper red on the HUD the closer you are to being seen, but it's not especially informative beyond a basic early warning, and the time it takes between being spotted and setting off the alarm is ridiculously short, particularly in the early levels. However, you can unlock a passive ability that increases the time between being initially spotted and setting off an alarm. You are also given a vision power, similar to how the detective vision from the Batman Arkham games works, or the instinct mode in the modern Hitman titles, but here it's just so aggravating to use. Rather than just show you where guards are on the different floors using its overlay, it also slows down time to a crawl so long as you're holding the key down.
Say, have you heard Charlie the last few days?
And I mean, it doesn't just slow it down slightly, but to the point where it takes seconds of time for a guard to put his foot down for each step. It's meant to be a quick glance to see your surroundings and figure out a path to avoid guards, I think, but just like everything else in the game, it's a half-informed idea at best. It would have been neat to put in cones of vision or something when scouting out areas so you can plan your path better, but as it is, this whole thing is just an annoyance rather than a help. So, you have some very limited tools to get past some rigid AI in some very generic, uninspired areas with annoyingly dull gameplay. What happens when these tools implode on you? Well, you trigger an alarm and enter combat. Now, you'd think that being a badass vampire means that you can make some mincemeat out of these guards, right? Well,
Good guess, but actually no.
your health is extremely limited in Dark, which itself isn't too much of a problem since 1, you can upgrade it, and 2, it's a stealth game and you should be encouraged not to enter combat. But the window between being seen and being gunned down is minuscule, Guards not only swarm you extremely quickly, but they also have guns, and you do not. And those guns hurt. And if you do try and engage a guard in melee combat, you'll find out that actually they can block your attacks fairly regularly, making it even harder to escape and hide somewhere. It really boils down to you being screwed if you're seen. It's a frustrating proposition because the way the gameplay is built makes for a tediously annoying means of playing it, meaning that there's little to no room for error. You will fail often, and it will be a very frustrating experience, mostly because the game doesn't offer any sort of width that allows you for any player expression. In the rare instances where you're able to make something of the game's obstacles, its implemented mechanics are terrible and actually prevent you from achieving your goals, with how poorly designed they are and how annoyingly difficult they are to utilize. Furthermore, what Dark does that's even more inexcusable is just when you think you understand what the guard's patterns are and how the AI is supposed to act, it likes to break its own rules of engagement on seemingly every single load of the save file. The same routines you've done on previous runs are suddenly null and void because the AI decided that, whereas previously it didn't see you turning down a particular corridor, now it does. Look at the footage right here of me reloading the same save over and over again, and despite me following through with the same exact pattern every single time I jump into the game, most of the time I get through just fine, but on occasion I'm spotted here during my approach, and even afterwards when I'm trying to get into position to perform the kill. The AI seems to be changing its actions on a whim. This makes the entire experience feel exceedingly unfair. Stealth games work because the AI acts in a predictable manner, and it's up to you to decide how big of a risk you're willing to take in a given situation. The choice to kill and hide a body, or sneak by and avoid detection, or to cause a distraction to move the guard away from a particular area, are all weighted differently depending on what you know about the AI's general reaction. When you take this away from the game, and when the basic patterns that you're accustomed to flip on a dime, the experience becomes oppressive. I'm not saying that stealth games can't be hard, but Dark's arbitrary AI is just unreasonable. I don't think I've played a game quite as bad as Dark in a long time. It's frankly quite terrible. Its mechanics are horribly underdeveloped, and the ones that are included in the game don't offer any sort of consistency that you'd expect, especially in the genre. The tools you're given to accomplish your goals are limited, and there is so little meat on the bone, you can't even make a broth out of it. I couldn't bring myself to finish this campaign for the sake of this review, and I have no desire to ever come back to this game ever again. That's how revolting I found this whole experience. You occasionally have a sense of the game trying to do something that doesn't feel like it's half-baked or broken or at least functions like it should, only to have the entire experience obliterated by a cascade of frailly designed systems that implode on you in one of several different ways. It's abhorrently frustrating and an incredibly irritating game to play. I cannot recommend this game at all, unless perhaps you're a masochistic Twitch streamer who enjoys playing stuff like this for the sake of entertaining your audience, or a YouTube reviewer who likes non-mainstream games and loves vampires. Either way, don't bother with Dark this Halloween, or ever, really, and if you've made it this far, I'd just like to say this. While I'm glad you stuck around to the end to watch this review, I can't help but feel that maybe you were better off being left in the dark than to be aware of the presence of Dark.
What is